Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our panel. We have four super papers in front of us. My name is Ijaz. I will be the chair and moderator of this panel, which means you have to listen to me very little. And I will just be sitting there and giving you a 15-minute, well, 15 minutes is what we start with, but I'll give you a 5-minute marker and a 1-minute marker to guide you to the end. And we'll have 5 minutes of discussion after each paper, open to Q&A following that. So with that, we can start with the first paper.
Right. So, oh, this is really loud. My name is Mahvish Shami, and the paper I'm presenting today is a co-authored piece with Haider Majid. And I'd like to start by saying I was a student here, and it's always been a dream of mine to present at Syed Sego. So I was very excited when I saw where I was presenting. So just to give a little bit of background, the paper looks at clientelism. And I'm assuming a lot of people in the crowd are familiar with clientelism. It's essentially how, in the presence of a dysfunctional state, you have people approaching people of resources, people of power, to get access to resources. And that could be simple things like getting a job, getting a house, getting access to food, or even more complicated things like getting access to public goods that the state is not providing to you. And this is it's a very vastly studied field, which has been going on for a very long time. But it tends to focus on urban or rural areas. So our paper sort of is one of the second. There's one other paper out there that uses actual household level data to compare urban and rural outcomes in terms of clientelism. So the question we're essentially investigating in this paper is who do citizens believe give them access to public goods? And there are two public goods we look at. One is your classic public goods of drainage and paved streets, which in Pakistan are sort of your very basic public goods, particularly in villages that villagers demand. And the second is dispute resolution. So as most of you must be aware, it's very difficult to access the police. So in that case, how do you get justice as an average citizen? And we're focusing on household perception of who is providing it to them, right? So it's not on who actually provided it, but who do they believe gave them access to these goods. So, I've sort of covered most of this, but historically, clientelism is seen as this face-to-face exchange relationship between groups of unequals. And the sort of catchphrase here was groups of unequals, and it was seen as an exploitative relationship where the landlord would exploit the peasants for as much as he could get out of them. And the peasant had nothing else and no other option, so therefore he was stuck with going along with this relationship. And as I said, most of this tended to, so the literature started off in the rural context with you had your landlords and your peasants and your serfs and how that relationship evolved. But in recent decades, we've come to realize actually that sort of stylized model does not hold anymore. These networks are actually very adaptive and they've evolved based on the environment in which they're based. So, as poverty has migrated to the cities, so has clientelism. We've come to realize that now the urban poor also engage in these relationships because they don't have access to state resources. And the extractive powers of these landlords are actually curtailed by the presence of exit options. And clients have much more bargaining power than was initially sort of stated in these early models. But there's a lot of fluidity in how these networks function. They're not homogeneous. It's not this one model of a broker or a patron at the top and your clients and peasants at the bottom. It's actually the level of bargaining power varies considerably, and part of it is affected by the geography, which is what we argue. In urban areas, they are much more fluid, as you would expect being in a big city, as opposed to in villages, which tend to be much more isolated, right? So building on that, what we did was we looked at slums in Pakistan and villages. And we chose Pakistan largely also because of its checkered history with democracy, which makes democratic institutions fairly weak. And the reliance on patronage politics has sort of persisted in its entire history till today. And we look at Lahore, slums in Lahore, so just around here, and Hafsabad, which is essentially the rice-producing area of Pakistan. And it's a fairly rural district. The biggest city is Hafsabad city, and when I went to visit it, I had to tell the driver, no, we're going to the city. And he's like, yes, this is the city. This is not the village. So it's a very rural district. So in terms of the methodology, we had 2x2 variation in both the urban areas and the rural ones. In slums, we looked at both registered and unregistered slums. Registered slums are those which the state has acknowledged as being legal settlements, and therefore they cannot be abolished. Unregistered slums continue to be illegal squatter colonies. And then they vary based on their location. So half of our slums are categorized as being in the center of Lahore, and half of them are in the periphery. Right? Similarly, in rural areas, we also have a 2x2 variation. Half of our villages are dominated by large landlords, which you would call sort of monopolist landlords who control all the land and all the resources. So what sort of historically you would think of as your landlord-based villages under the British. And then half of them are what we term egalitarian villages. That does not mean that there are no landlords, it's just that there are multiple landlords. So in an average village, there'd be about 15 to 20 landlords, which means there's competition amongst them for clientelist following. So that clearly changes the nature of that relationship. Moreover, half of our villages are on the motorway link road. So they're extremely connected to Hafsabad city, but also to other cities. But even if peasants are not traveling outside of the village, what they do is they bring traffic to the city, to the village. So there's sort of thoroughfare going through the village, and these villagers are now very used to outsiders, and they can use these as opportunities for themselves. So, they can set up little tea shops, they can set up car repair shops and stuff like that. So there's sort of more opportunities outside of the landlord in these villages. And half of them are far enough that you would classify them as being isolated. So when we visited these isolated villages, all these, some of the students who went with me are sitting here, they can vouch for this. Kids would come to sort of look at us because they had not seen outsiders in ages. And who were these people coming in their fancy joggers and their funny clothes, asking all these questions, whereas in the connected villages, nobody cared. So moving on, so just looking at basic public goods provisioning across these villages. As one would expect, urban slums receive much higher public goods provisioning than rural areas. And this is both drains and paved streets, right? But the question we were interested was not so much on the level of provisioning, but who was providing it. So we would ask that, who was instrumental in getting you these public goods? And the answer was very interesting. By far, the majority in villages would name the local landlord or their local patron or broker, whatever you want to call it. So it was their clientelist network that was giving them access to public goods from the state, not the politician. And when you went to, when you went to an isolated village dominated by a large landlord, this number increased significantly more. Because this is where the landlord had complete control, and he was essentially the owner of this village, and he dictated what went on. So here, almost everybody believed that he was the person giving you access to state provision. And I'd like to point out that these were also the villages where you had the least amount of provisioning, right? In slums, it was a very, very different story. In slums, politicians actively come and claim credit for provisioning. Lahore is a very important political capital. Politicians do not want to take the risk of not getting credit for provisioning. But also, the nature of clientelist networks are very different in slums than they are in villages. And this is what the paper sort of brings out much more. In villages, you have a very stable vote block system. You have a very stable clientelist network, even in egalitarian villages, which allows brokers to act as gatekeepers. That is not the case in the slums. In slums, it's much more fluid. These relationships are constantly renegotiated. Slum residents are constantly changing networks. Some of them only join it during electoral cycles. So it's a very different type of clientelist network, due to which politicians do not sort of secede decision-making to local patrons. They take credit, they send someone from their office, or they come themselves to make sure that people know that they provided this drain and they provided this street. And of course, this was all done around electoral cycles. So yeah, exactly. So in slums also, what you find is these clientelist networks tend to have much lower levels of enrollment as opposed to in the villages. So just to give you numbers, in the villages, about almost close to 90% of households were part of a clientelist network, whereas in slums it went to about 50 max. And again, when you sort of dig deeper, you realize that some of them were only joining during electoral cycles, not all year round, all year round. So the question becomes, what do urban brokers do, right? The only way these networks survive is if they provide something. People are joining it to get something out of it. And what is that? Because it's clearly not public goods, which is sort of the big good that, or sort of drains and streets, which is the big goods Pakistanis tend to ask for. So what is it that he is providing them? And the other good we looked at was dispute resolution. So as I said, most of you here are Pakistani, so you'd be aware that the police is problematic. Getting access to justice is a big problem in Pakistan, particularly for poor people. So how do they gain access to justice? And what we found was that this was the big service urban brokers were providing to their clients. They would assist them with dispute resolution either through their informal networks, or their informal dispute resolution, or by going along with them to the police to provide extra support to ensure the minimizing of harassment by the police itself. And this service, as you can imagine, was provided predominantly to their own clients. So this is the big thing that a broker would provide, and this was the main reason urban residents would join these clientelist networks. And this was very, very interesting to us because this is very different from what we found in rural households. And it all sort of comes down to a function of exit options. In slums, you have greater exit options. These slums tend to be more fluid. People are coming and going, which also impacts how these networks function, which means that slum residents have more options, not just from outside the slum, but also in terms of the brokers they can have. Similarly, in egalitarian villages, because there were multiple landlords, it meant that there were multiple clientelist networks you could pick from, which then increased your bargaining power. If one broker did not provide you what you needed, you would switch networks. That was not an option in your landlord-dominated villages, due to which there were higher levels of exploitation. Also, in slums, you're closer to the state. You're closer to the politician. Politicians in rural areas very seldom went down to the village. They would just contract with the broker because the broker would guarantee you votes, right? So increasing exit options then essentially reduces the hold of this broker and allows citizens to get more out of their network. But also, it is heartening to see that when you weaken these clientelist networks and you water them down, we are seeing higher levels of provisioning. So think back to the graph I showed you. Slums do receive much higher levels of public goods provisioning, which could potentially be a function of these watered down networks. But I have to sort of throw sort of caution to the wind, because this provision, I should point out, is by no means programmatic. This is very targeted provisioning that comes close to an electoral cycle, and they are all aware of this. They very sort of openly say, my drain is breaking down, but don't worry, an election is coming very soon, so it's going to get fixed. So, and it didn't bother them that it was low quality, targeted, blatant vote capturing, but they were like, at least we're getting something out of it. But it's a step in the right direction. So it's something to think about, how we can sort of wean off clientelist networks and get the state to provide more to these peasants. Thank you very much. Oh, there we go. I'm gonna come down.
Stand here? I can just.
You can stand there if you want.
Am I allowed to stand? Okay, so thanks a lot. I have the hard task of giving Giving comments on such an amazing paper. I have to admit that I've promised Mahvish that I'm going to send in more detailed comments after fully reading the paper, but I was able to go through bits and pieces. So please, free disposal. The paper is very fascinating. It gives a lot of detail in trying to understand how, these kind of networks and how people believe that they're getting public goods and from whom are they getting public goods, and how that differs by the environment in which these networks are located, right? And so a few things that I'm just wondering, and I don't know if that's even like, maybe it's beyond the scope of your study. So I think what I was wondering was, since you did like these primary, you did primary data collection, you went and you had surveys, I think it would be so useful for the paper to have detailed descriptives on who these people are. So you have people who are connected to brokers, you have people who are not connected to brokers, and then there are all these other dimensions of heterogeneity. I think it would add so much richness to the paper if you could give us like more details about who these people are, what their backgrounds are, etc. So one thing I was wondering about with the urban-rural, the bar graph you showed about public goods, and the fact that there is more public good provision in urban locations is what I understood. Is that by per capita, or it would be useful to see if that's by per capita or not, because once it's normalized, you'll probably see a difference, right? You're going to have more in the rural and less in the urban. Then, I'm going to leave out the econometrics part, but I don't think this is not an econometrics paper. It's beautifully descriptive, and it's fascinating. So then we come to the mechanisms. From my understanding, these are stated beliefs of people about who are those set of people who are giving them public goods, and who are their main sort of brokers with the state, or people who can provide them access to the state and its services. So are there, given the large literature, and this is probably beyond the scope of study, but given the large literature that's out there on biased beliefs, etc., it seems to me like what you're capturing is that first stage, that beliefs get changed, but is it really the case that people were getting these public goods from these actors that they thought that they were getting them from, or they wanted to get from? So that final linkage of that belief translating into a reality can also be useful, maybe in a complementary paper. Then the last thing I want to say is about, so you have these, and my understanding was that the communities were stratified based on registered, unregistered, egalitarian, and landlord dominated. Of course, these are the most natural, so I would have done the same thing. These are the most natural sort of divisions. I think given that you're making a comparison between the two groups, right? So rural-urban is your comparison. Do you think, maybe we can have some base which is common between the two, right? So you're making a comparison, but then you stratified communities on different dimensions. So in the urban, it's more state registering and state sort of accepting that the slum exists, whereas in the rural, it's more like landlord versus not. Maybe that also is a state acceptance, in some way. I don't know, but I think that there has to be a commonality, and then you do a comparison, and then we can see, oh, these things are very different. But because we sampled from different communities, maybe what we're saying is just a result of that. But overall, a phenomenal paper. Thank you. I look forward to reading it, and I'll provide you detailed comments as promised. Thank you.
We should take a round of questions. Thank you, Shan.
Of course.
Next speaker, but,
Am I? I thought I'm the third speaker.
I'm the next speaker. Are you not? So sorry. Okay.
Happy to
Great.
go next. If you want.
So from the audience, we can take a round of questions. There's Sarah over there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mahvish. This is really, really fascinating. And perhaps there's more detail on this in the paper, but I had a question about measurement of networks and kind of how you identify whether an individual is in the network. Is that based on simply knowing the person, or is there some more intensive bar for being considered part of a network? And then the second question is about dispute resolution, which I found really fascinating that is something that brokers in the urban context are doing. And I wondered what that looks like in the rural context. And in part, is it also the case that residents in your rural sample are turning to informal dispute resolution, and whether that is sort of driving the difference in the function that brokers are playing, right? So in urban areas, there's more of this need for intermediaries because there's engagement with formal dispute resolution. Thank you.
work. And to kind of answer one of the questions that Shan brought up about kind of completing the link. So that's the question I had, because I find in my work that if you ask people, and this is looking at local politicians, so not looking at brokers, but very councillor level politicians, and if you ask them, do you think that this good will be provided to you, whether you were to vote for them or not, and they always respond that we will get this good during electoral cycles, irrespective of whether we actually did our vote for them or not, which kind of makes it, in my view, it's a different kind of clientelism in the sense that the transaction is not complete. So people know that we may or may not capture the vote, but they're still willing to provide at that time. So I just wanted to, I in my work kind of frame it as this is potentially leading to some form of accountability. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts on that. And the other thing, just who are the politicians that you are looking at, particularly in the rural setting? So are those local level politicians, or are you looking at provincial? Because you said it's the landlords who are doing most of the provisioning. And finally, when you say that there is non-programmatic provision in the urban slums, is that because they're getting this dispute resolution good and not the programmatic sort of paved streets and all of those, which I would think are more programmatic goods? Is that why you're saying it's non-programmatic provisioning, or is it because it's being done during the electoral cycles? Thank you so much.
We got one more question over there, and then we'll come back.
So thanks a lot. I learned already a lot by listening. For me, the story makes sense with like the differences in exploitation or extraction, and you've provided this evidence that there's more public good provision, right? That's one side of the coin. The other is like how much do the the people have to provide to the broker? Like what is kind of how much do the brokers get out? Is there some evidence on that there's the differential, and kind of how much is they are exploited in a way?
Last question.
It's a fascinating paper, Mahvish. One thing you didn't talk about, and I'm curious about, is the difference between connected and isolated rural areas. Because are the connected villages closer to the urban results or not? Because we know that in Punjab, something like 80% of the population lives in areas which are very well connected, and so that would be interesting to me. Thank you.
Over to you, Mahvish.
Okay, great, thank you. Sorry, let me just write this down so I don't forget it. Let me start with Shan's comments. Yes, so descriptive statistics it was a very tight space, so it's a lot that had to be fit in. With your question about the common base, that's an easy one to answer. These were two very separate data sets collected completely independent of each other, and there was never a plan to put them together. It was only recently we read a paper by Adam Orbeck from American University. Like, oh, we have rural and urban data too, so we could have a look. So this is sort of a first step. But that's a good point to flag, and I think we'll raise that in the paper, that these were independent data sets collected for different purposes. So it sort of lends itself to collect more data in the future with the intention of having commonality. The part about stated belief it's a great point that people have biased beliefs, and that's fine. But this is more a question of who do you think is getting you the good? Who's getting credit for it? And in rural areas, it's not the politician. They're very clear. Our patron went to the politician and got it for us. Whereas here, the politician got it for us. The broker in the middle didn't do anything. So that's sort of the way it's phrased. So they are wrong. It is the state giving it. And it is a belief, and that's why it says it's a function of what households believe. And you might be right. It might be that as more awareness is spreading when you're in an urban area, you're more aware of it. But the politician is coming down himself also to make sure people know it is him that's providing it. So he's also dispelling false beliefs. I never thought of doing it per capita, but I should point out that the village sizes are very similar to the slum sizes. So I would think it would still be much higher. And I think it's because the sort of starting ground in slums is higher. So they have to provide more to keep building on it, whereas the villages had nothing. Is that everything? Yeah, I think that's about most of what you've... with Sarah, with measuring clientelist networks, there was a series of questions we asked. So we start out by asking who's the influential your household is aligned with, and what's the basis of his authority? Why do you go to him? But then throughout the survey, at different points, we would ask, oh, so you have this problem, who do you go for it? Oh, so your land got taken away, who did you go? You had a dispute problem, who do you go to? And then we sort of check to make sure it's the same person, and that allowed us to create. So that's when you have a network, when you go to the same person for multiple problems. And then, so I have a paper that I actually presented here last time, which was on dispute resolution in rural areas. So dispute resolution, it's not a rural or urban problem, it's a Pakistani problem, right? It's even well-off people avoid going to the police because it results in harassment and you have to pay bribes and all sorts of other problems. And it's particularly pronounced for the poor. And that's true in rural areas as well as urban. So for sort of petty crimes, a lot of times they would just get solved in-house, so to speak. So the broker would just help solve sort of disputes between neighbors, or if it's a small sort of theft or something. But for bigger crimes, you do have to go to the police, right? So if it's a I don't know, big fight with people getting beaten up or with murders, you have to go. And in that case, as I said, it would involve him either going along or him sending someone with you. But what I found is that when brokers had extreme control in rural areas, they would actually block you from going alone. So it wasn't even an option. You had to go through the broker. But we can talk more about it because I had all sorts of other questions to tease out your level of access to justice that I don't think we have too much time for here. So Shahbano, you're right. At some level, this is democracy doing what it's doing, right? Politicians targeting constituents to get what they should get. And you're absolutely right. These politicians do not know whether these people will vote for them. The broker does, right? He has complete control, which is why in rural areas, they go through him. But the reason I say it's non-programmatic is it's not based on need. So in the paper, I go in more detail on that. It's the ones in the periphery have much lower levels of provisioning. That's where they should be targeting if they want to sort of have an egalitarian provision level. But they continue to target the center because they're more visible and everyone can see that, look, they're doing something. So it's not being given to who needs it most. And that's the case in rural areas also. Where were we? So what do brokers get out of it? That's a great question, and I think that's a whole other paper. Sadly, a journal only gives you about 8,000 to 10,000 words. But in the rural areas, it's pretty clear, right? These are landlords, and they have them where the big service peasants provide is agricultural labor. Labor is very important, particularly during sowing and harvesting season, where it tends to even get in short supply. So having a guaranteed supply of labor is very valuable. And most of these peasants don't realize how valuable they are. So as a block, they could actually put a lot of pressure on the landlord. In urban areas, it gets a little more watered down. So it's more of a political service they get. So they get social benefits because they can sort of show that they have all these followings and they're the leader. But also politically, even though the politician doesn't give up control over public goods, he does still contract with these brokers. So there is some sort of rent seeking going on in exchange for the votes of their clients. But it is, as I said, it's a much more watered down system. Network. I have written a range of papers going into great detail between connected and isolated villages. Connectivity has done wonders. And I was telling somebody else this recently, how on the surface, nothing has changed. They still work for the landlord. They still go to the landlord. Everything works exactly as every other village. But it's when you start talking to people, you realize attitudes and reasons for joining the network have changed. So in connected villages, when I would ask that, why does he help you? He's like, they're very clear. Because he wants our votes. He wants us to work for him. That is why. If he doesn't do what we want him to, we will leave. In isolated villages, when I would ask that, they would say, but how will we feed our children if we defy him? Sure, I'll get a drain, but then what? And if he kicks us out of the village, we're doomed. So there is a stark difference. Connectivity makes a huge difference, due to which Shahbaz Sharif's roads are a great idea. So I'm the poster child for his politics. But yeah, it's sort of changing people's opportunity. It's raising their opportunity cost from 0 to market values. Yeah, I think that's about everything. Thank you very much. These were great comments.
Thank you, Mahvish, and thank you to the audience for a great set of questions to start us out with. Our next speaker, Shahbano from Occidental College.
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. And like Mahvish, I was also a student here. So, this is indeed, it's good to be on this side. But also, I wanted to acknowledge that I'm part of an all-female panel where all other scholars are more senior than me. And and doing great work. And so, it's exciting. I'm humbled to be in this company. So what I'm presenting today is part of my dissertation and what I hope to be a book project. It's called Demanding the Last Mile, Foreign Aid and Political Preferences in Pakistan. I just want to share a little bit of motivation. The reason I started this project is because a lot of research on foreign aid in developing countries focuses on how elites can co-opt foreign aid. So it's about them using foreign aid to target it towards their constituents, or there's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of leakage, but there is very little work done on how much voters actually know about the fact that foreign aid exists, or that benefits exist, that they can actually receive. And therefore, this work is kind of focusing on the voter recipient side of the story to kind of show that they can do things to get the aid benefits that others might be trying to keep from them. So the question that the research primarily asks is, can foreign aid change political preferences as well as participation in recipient states? The argument that I make briefly is that the last mile of aid delivery, so this is right when the benefits have to get to the people, is interrupted by bureaucratic and informational hurdles. And voters recognize these hurdles. So they know that there is this benefit that exists, but there is something that is keeping me from getting to this benefit. And therefore, they change their political preferences to demanding the kind of goods and services that will help them leap that last mile and get to those benefits. And politicians, and these are local level politicians, they often respond to these voter demands. So these are resource-constrained politicians who have little else to offer, but can offer facilitative services by supplying these broadly to the people who need them. And therefore, the argument I'm making is that the creation of public programs through some kind of foreign aid outlay shifts political preferences towards asking for these last mile goods and also improves political participation. The way I test this is through a natural experiment. So I'll talk more about this in detail, but most of you probably know about the Benazir Income Support Program. So I'm looking specifically at that program, and the inclusion into the program is based on a poverty score, and I look at households that are distributed very closely around that poverty score. I do a survey of households. This is a telephone-based survey distributed close to the discontinuity, and then I tease out differences in their political demands, their levels of political participation, based on whether or not they're eligible for the program. So what exactly is last mile service delivery? This is a term that I've borrowed from logistics, and I apply it to the public goods literature and define it as publicly provided services that help eligible benefits, eligible citizens who are eligible for a particular good, obtain the benefits that they're entitled to receive. So in the life cycle of any public good, there is a budget allocation. Here I make the claim that part of it is coming through foreign aid. Maybe it is a form of conditionality. Maybe it is some kind of support, some kind of monitoring and evaluation that leads to the establishment of the program. And then the program has certain eligibility criteria. So who is going to get included into the program? Who is going to get excluded from the program? And then there is an enrollment period, so people get enrolled in the program. And finally, they get the benefits. And it's that movement from eligibility to actually obtaining the benefit that I define as the last mile of service delivery. And those of us who have lived in other countries are familiar that this is the case in all publicly provided services across the board. So for example, Medicare in the US, between being eligible for the program and actually going to your first doctor's visit, that's what I term as the last mile. And we know that there are bureaucratic hurdles there, right? So you have to supply certain documentation, you have to go to a county officer, give an interview, make sure that you're meeting all the eligibility criteria, then get an insurance program, find a primary care provider, and then make the doctor's visit. So all of that, those sort of informational and bureaucratic hurdles exist in almost all states, but the ones that exist in developing countries, specifically Pakistan, are very different. And these are two examples that came out in my interviews with counselors in Punjab. One of them has to do with fingerprinting. So I think a lot of us are familiar that there is biometric fingerprinting required to obtain the BISP funding. And this came up again and again, that women often have blurred fingerprints because they are washing clothes and dishes. And so they need to do an extra thing. They have to go to their local counselor or a gazetted officer and get an affidavit saying that they cannot be fingerprinted, and so they should be able to retrieve the money without getting biometric verification. Or just the mobility problem. So a lot of women said, I also did interviews with women who said that it is difficult for us to just make that visit and actually obtain the money. So these are the kind of last mile hurdles that I'm talking about, the kind of facilitation services that voters are looking to receive. So just a brief look at the theory. Foreign aid, the role of foreign aid here is that it is very pivotal to the creation of public programs. What happens is that potential beneficiaries, who I find in Pakistan are very aware that these programs exist and that they can benefit from them, they experience feelings of ownership. So there's literature that shows that citizens know these benefits are intended for them and that they're willing to go and make demands in order to access these benefits. However, in doing this, they face barriers to access. So they know this program exists, but I have to get registered, I have to get a national ID card, then I have to make sure I know what the poverty score is, et cetera, et cetera. They're also aware of program quality. And again, this is where foreign aid is important because there's a lot of monitoring and evaluation that is done by third parties. So they know that once they get into the program, they will be able to get access to it. This leads to increased demand for last mile service delivery. So they seek these services from their local elected politicians. They want them to help facilitate them to actually get to these benefits. And I argue that this allows them, in an otherwise information-constrained environment, to actually judge their politicians' quality and just increase their political knowledge. So now they know whether or not this politician is going to provide them with something because they've actually made an ask. And overall, this increases political participation more broadly. So my theory lends itself to three testable hypotheses. I'm going to focus on the two at the bottom today. The first one is that exposure to foreign aid should increase demand for these last mile services as opposed to other public goods, and that it should allow voters to be able to evaluate their politicians. In the paper, I also look at incumbent support, that those who are actually providing them last mile services should get rewarded at the ballot. So to rephrase again, the first hypothesis is that voters from households that are eligible for foreign aid, so these are BISP-eligible households, are more likely to demand last mile services than voters from ineligible households. And voters from these households are also more likely to evaluate local politicians, to be able to say how their politicians perform on certain characteristics than voters from ineligible households. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we know that the Benazir Income Support Program was created in 2008. It was created largely in response to an IMF conditionality that required Pakistan to have a social safety net. It is one of the largest social safety nets in Pakistan, targeted primarily towards women, although the eligibility, the poverty score, and the fiscal flow is at the household level. So the poverty score gets determined according to household level characteristics. This poverty score is collected via scorecards in a household survey. This is done at a point in time. So it was done in 2010, more recently in 2022. And therefore, there is some room to manipulate the eligibility in the sense that you can go back and ask to be revisited or reassessed or if circumstances has changed. But it is more or less the case that you will get it if you are eligible for the program and not if you're not eligible. And this is at the time when I did the survey, the payments were equivalent to about $9 per month. This is a distribution of the poverty score in the population from the last PSLM. So initially, the eligibility score used to be around 16, but after the last survey in 2021, I believe, it was moved to 32. So there's a large population of Pakistan that's actually eligible to receive BISP transfers, now according to the new poverty score. So how do I measure last mile service delivery? This is a survey that is done between, fielded to households that are distributed just around the eligibility threshold. I give them a choice, so I ask them whether they would like to ask their local politician for public transportation, which I see as a good that will help them with last mile facilitation, or ask for local law and order. And the second choice is whether they would like to have an ID card camp. So this is necessary in order to get inclusion into the program versus a vaccination camp. And then I asked them to rank 5 options. Again, 2 of these are what I categorize as last mile goods, document verification, and having a cell phone signal tower, because a lot of the eligibility verification happens through SMSs. So you have to SMS your ID card number, and then you get told whether or not you're eligible, against 3 more conventional public goods. So I'm going to go quickly over the empirical strategy. It's a regular fuzzy regression discontinuity design. I asked them, so the outcome of interest is obviously demand for last mile services. DI is an indicator for whether or not the household is eligible according to the poverty score, which I have for each household. And then I also asked them whether or not they're actually receiving BISP. And I use that to instrument. And you all know that this allows me to compare households that are very alike, except that they're different in terms of eligibility. So these are the results. I find that households that are eligible before BISP are more likely to ask for public transportation and for ID card camps versus households that are ineligible. Similarly, I find that they're slightly more likely to ask for document verification, but less likely to ask for conventional goods like free food distribution. And this is not, I claim that this is not necessarily a Weld effect, because a lot of these households, again, this poverty score eligibility threshold shifted very recently. So these are households that have just been included. So this is, I'm looking at PMT scores 29 to 32. Sorry, 29 to 33, and 32 is the cutoff. Then I also asked them if they can rate their local councillor in terms of capacity, approachability, and honesty. This is not a ranking. This is just, can you rate them or not, a yes or no question. And I find that households that are eligible are more likely to say that they know about their politician's quality. Do they rank them higher if they're able to get access to these last mile services? I find that in terms of capacity and approachability, they do rank them higher, not necessarily in terms of honesty. So there are no results on honesty. Future turnout. So does this increase political participation? There is no movement on political participation. But in my sample, I also found that more than 80% of the respondents claimed they will turn out in the next elections to vote. So this is a very high sort of bar to begin with. Looking at non-electoral participation, so again, those who are eligible are more likely to rank their politicians higher. They're also more likely to know the names of their politicians. So they have more contact with the state. Now, moving on to the foreign aid aspect. Do people believe that foreign aid belongs to the people at large? If they're more likely to agree with this statement, they're more likely to ask for document verification and less likely to ask for conventional public goods like grocery rations and free food distribution. Does program quality matter? Not as much for the choice variables, but again, in terms of ranking, it moves them up on document verification. So because those who think that the program is actually good are more likely to ask for document verification camps. Just kind of concluding, what this work basically does is it shows that voters know that they have access to these programs and they have the agency to change their political behavior, change their political demands, to kind of bridge the problems that arise because, and this is, I flesh this out more in the paper, because of donor agencies. So when donor agencies say, we want you to use biometric verification so we can collect data, We want to have strong inclusion criteria so that there is no leakage. It creates hurdles for voters, but they are able to kind of overcome these hurdles through this creative use of political agency. In a way, it recreates the citizen-state contract at the local level around this exchange of services in the very last mile. Some of the questions that I get is, does this apply only to programs that are funded through foreign aid? And I think that it applies, this kind of ability to overcome last mile problems will apply to programs that are non-discretionary. So anywhere where you have this eligibility criteria for inclusion, exclusion might create hurdles, and voters are able to step up and overcome these hurdles. However, foreign aid has reputational spillovers, particularly in the case of Pakistan. So when programs are funded by the World Bank, when people know this is money that is coming from external sources, they're more likely to trust the program will persist. And so therefore, they're more likely to actually engage in asking for the program. Thank you so much. I look forward to your feedback.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Erum Haider. I am Assistant Professor of Political Science and Environmental Studies at the College of Wooster, and I have the pleasure of being a discussant on Shahbano's incredible paper. So Shahbano, I followed your work for some time, and I have to commend you on a really fabulous sort of, I think this is going to be the core of your book project. So I can't commend you enough on, I know personally how hard it is to put these pieces of data together. And I think we don't give enough credit to just how terribly difficult this is, right? So at some point, you had to not only convince somebody in government to release this data to you, but also give it to you in precise enough detail that then you could match it to households in the field. I'd love to know more about sort of your field work and the places that you went to. I think that's terribly fascinating. But I want to say that overall, your ability to match eligible populations and beneficiaries to government data sets is extremely difficult. And perhaps as part of a note in an early chapter or to this, I would love for you to emphasize that more, right? I would love for you to emphasize just how incredibly difficult this is. And I think this is part of the paper itself, right? I think this is not sort of a sidebar, oh, I went and did all this work. To me, the motivation is great. I really like the piece that you give us on foreign aid and how we sort of assume that elites co-opt foreign aid, but this is a really great example of how really poor and non-literate voters are actually aware that there's something coming in from outside that they are eligible for. So this is tremendous. I always think we can be more ambitious with our motivation, and I want you to think a little bit about how foreign aid can impose costs on the state and also on beneficiaries, right? And I know you treat this to some extent in your paper, and you say, yes, it can impose costs, but then voters are able to come around these costs. To me, it's really interesting because part of what you're looking at is whether the distribution or the disbursement of foreign aid also creates dependencies, right? So this idea that we want cash transfers wherever they're done in the world, whether it's Latin America, whether it's Africa, we want cash transfers primarily to be a seamless, frictionless way for the poorest of the poor to get money in their pocket, to get themselves basic goods and services, right? And this process of having to then go and get verification from your union council and get biometrics because your hands are too calloused, this to me is crazy, right? Like, to me, this is imposing costs on these very poor people. Could there be easier ways to do this? Yes, definitely. But I want you to think in the context of your work whether if cash transfers are intended to reduce costs on the very poor and hopefully also reduce dependencies, does it fulfill this, right? So is there a way within your data to see how satisfied are people with this process of having to go to their counselor or go to their politician to demand these last mile services? Or is this something that they just wish they could do without, right? Rahan Jamil's really great work shows that, as you're also seeing, that voting actually declines after being eligible for or getting a cash transfer. And part of the reason he sort of says is because you no longer need your politician, right? So you're like, okay, why should I bother go voting for them? And that's a good thing, right? You're no longer locked into these dependencies where someone's giving you something and you have to trudge across and do this big show of voting for the guy who you really don't like, but you just kind of have to, right? So I'd like you to think a little bit more about that. I really like your sort of idea of improving participation. I do see how being included in this program does increase your exposure to the state, and that's tremendously interesting. I think the really crucial thing is here that they know that they are eligible, and that puts pressure on their representatives. I want to see whether this spills over into other goods. So maybe, as you're saying, you're looking at people who are just eligible 5 years on, or even like 2 years on. Is there a difference in the basket of goods that they're demanding? Now that they've had this $9 a month come in consistently, is there other basket of goods that comes in? And then if you could reflect a little bit on how foreign aid that is distributed through the government and not third-party actors is going to have different effects, right? And we had a great conversation on the first day on sort of a lot of the development in Bangladesh, for example, has happened through third-party actors and nonprofit. BISP is a really great example of this being through the government. So how does this create, on the one hand, dependencies, but on the other hand, this accountability structure, instead of teasing that out maybe through some of your qualitative work. But overall, this is such an impressive project, and I look forward to seeing it in a book form. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erum, for those excellent comments, and for Shahbano to helping us continue this theme of how citizens can get services from the state. Okay, so over to the crowd. Start with Rocco.
Thanks so much. Really enjoyed this and looking forward to seeing where it goes. I've got a couple of questions. First is, you're doing a phone survey, and yet you're asking questions about cell phone towers. So isn't there a bit of selection there? I'm not sure what, yeah. And then you frame this as like political agency, but it feels like what you're measuring is more sort of passive preferences for certain things. So could you just elaborate a little bit on how to make that jump from preferences that people are asked to elicit in a survey to how they actually act? And then on the foreign aid angle, I wasn't quite clear on how the source of the funding of these programs matters to people. Do they even know, do they even care where the funding comes from? And that seems like quite a sort of keystone of your framing that I didn't quite get. Yeah, thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Aman. Thank you so much for this talk. I was going to echo what Rocco just said. I think it's quite important to measure who these people think this program is associated with. So we have older work from Kate and Hasib showing that now they do think that it is more technocratic and less involved in the government ever since the introduction of the PMT. But also in follow-up work that I'm doing with them, it does seem like people still associate it very much specifically with Benazir Bhutto. So to what extent, where do people think that this program is coming from? Because for all of the last mile actions that you're thinking of, you do need to interact with the BISP official or a NADRA official, not your politician necessarily, to get that stuff done. But in what, is it that they still attribute it to the politician, or is it that these particular technocrats who were instituted specifically so that the dependency on the politicians is eliminated are not delivering this, are not doing their job? So that's just one thing. And then second, I think it would be really nice to know what are the baseline characteristics of this sample, because I would have imagined that, like maybe many of them already have ID documents or some of the services, and that's why they're not demanding the eminence. And they're not that necessary in the last mile because they're very necessary in the first instance of even being surveyed by the NSCR.
Hi, Shahbano. So BISP is an unconditional cash transfer program, right? How do you think your results might generalize to a conditional cash transfer where the need for political engagement might be a little bit greater, I suppose?
Yeah. So my question is, so my name is Mohammed. My question is more about like identification. So I was thinking of, so you're trying to understand the effect of the source of funding on the outcome variables. How do you distinguish that from just the effect of getting cash? Because the discontinuity is between eligibility for cash versus not, right? So where is really the variation in the source of funding, and how are you basically using that discontinuity to say something about the source of funding?
Was there one more hand at the front? Okay. And then Shahbano, I don't think you need to feel obliged to answer every question in detail, but it's better to include.
Hi, so I'm Adil, and my question was kind of similar regarding identification. I'm from Mohammed in the back. Like, how do you disentangle like just exposure effects to the government, and also like you're kind of, when they go to the government to kind of get biometrically verified, you're priming them on just like knowing about, say, like verification, and so after like doing that, perhaps you just like understand the importance of that more. So like how do you disentangle the priming and the exposure effects from like what you're saying, which is something like deeper about like understanding of service delivery?
Got it. Okay, so quickly responding. Field work. This was done mostly during COVID, which was even more challenging. So initially, I had data on 9 districts in Punjab and distributed around the initial discontinuity, which was 16.17, and then shifted to a representative telephone survey. So then I had data. I also did a WhatsApp survey. So I have data on 30,000 households. The WhatsApp survey does all, but the telephone survey is limited to 3,000. So it was, in terms of where I went, so I spoke to counselors in Punjab, and then I did focus groups with BISP beneficiaries in the Islamabad office, and also in rural Punjab, so close to Multan. Could there be easier ways to do cash transfers? Absolutely. So I don't think that this is what they should be asking for. I don't think it's like what we've been discussing throughout this conference, right? It's the second best. So it's not the first best. They should not be asking for last mile facilitation. They should be asking for other goods. But it's just that this is the first step towards getting to know that there is a political process and politicians will respond. Okay. In terms of foreign aid coming through the government, so I think that's important. I think that not only should foreign aid come through the government, I make the case somewhat in the broader dissertation that politicians, local politicians, have very crucial knowledge of where people are and what people's needs are. And so these are very specific politicians. Most of the counselors I spoke to are people, and which is why I was interested in Mahvish's work on, when is there an overlap between landlord and politician? Because a lot of these were just slightly more educated people in their communities who decided that they wanted to run for counselor because they wanted to be able to serve their community better. And so they are not distanced from their constituents. They told me that, we count our constituents as people jinke chule pe humne khana khaya. And so, we've been there, we eat with them. We know who they are, we know what their needs are. And we are driven by an interest to serve, which I thought, part of it is obviously social desirability bias, them telling me what I want to hear, but I also think that there was this aspect of service, at least at the very local level. Phone survey versus cell phone towers, yes, I haven't actually thought about that because this was a survey done on cell phones, but the idea of the cell phone tower was basically to find out whether they would get better service, because in a lot of these communities, they will go to the person who has the cell phone or has the ability to go somewhere to actually find out about their eligibility, whether it's political agency or just passive preferences. So the WhatsApp survey actually adds a cost. So that's where I move it from preferences to whether they want to bear a cost to actually make a demand, which is, can you send an SMS asking for the thing you want? And so that is forthcoming work. I haven't looked at the analysis yet. Source of funding. So I get this question every time I present. This is not foreign aid because people don't perceive it as foreign aid. And in my theory, it doesn't matter whether people perceive it as foreign aid. In fact, to your question, Aman, a lot of people, you're right. Initially, there was so I started working on this in 2016 when there was a lot more sentiment of this is coming from Benazir Bhutto. A lot of women thought that this was her inheritance that she had left to the women of Pakistan. There is much less of that now. As in my phone survey, a lot of people knew that this is like Hasib and Viburney find that this is something which is provided from the state that they are entitled to receive. However, first, they still have to overcome those hurdles and they go to the counselor, the local level politician, because they know that they can resolve their problems. And often it is easier for them to communicate to the counselor than to the bureaucrat. But in future work, I want to look at whether there is a way that local bureaucrats might be better at doing this. But the foreign aid is really, it's an indirect effect. It's the fact that foreign aid keeps the program running with the efficiency with which it runs. So this is one of the programs in Pakistan that has been monitored the most, evaluated the most. There's Oxford Policy Management has done like multiple rounds of surveys trying to find out where are the grievances, like What do people like? What do people not like? And it is foreign aid because of which you have these biometric verification things because the government needs data to ask for more money. So they say, we do it so well, there's no leakage, there's no inclusion errors, which is why if you fund SAS, which is based on the same PMT score infrastructure, it's going to run great because, this runs great. And so I think there is an indirect effect of foreign aid in improving program quality, and people are aware of it. They know that because, in the survey experiment I ask, there's a survey experiment I do as part of the survey where some of them get told it's a foreign aid program, they rank it higher in terms of quality. So I think it's an indirect effect rather than a direct effect. Identification, yes, so I am using eligibility as a proxy for whether or not they're getting exposed to this program. Whether I'm priming them, so I'm not actually telling them that this is a survey that has anything to do with BISP. The BISP data I have from administrative records. They're just getting a political survey. What do you want? Like, would you rather demand X versus Y? But they don't know that I'm doing this to find out whether they're BISP eligibility. And then in order to not prime them, the BISP questions are right at the end of the survey. Do you actually get BISP? So they do the whole survey, and then they get asked about whether or not they get the program. But I hope that answers most of the questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Shahbano, and thanks everyone for continuing the excellent questions. Over to our next speaker, Shan, Aman, Rana, joining us from the University of Virginia.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for including this paper. I'm very excited to present this. This is actually the second time I think I'm presenting it. This is on spillovers in state capacity building. This is joint work with Clemo and Audia. And this is part of our larger research agenda in trying to understand, we know that state capacity is important, but where does that animal come from? So this is like, we're trying to contribute to that agenda, and I look forward to your feedback. So like I said, I think finally economists are catching up to the political scientists and sociologists, who've been saying this for ages, but finally we recognize that state capacity building is important for development. The larger sort of open question right now is, how do you build that state capacity? So part of that, those conversations that are happening, the biggest push that we're getting, at least developing countries are getting, is from the World Bank and the IMF, et cetera, is that, maybe you should go for technology because technology will cut through the bureaucracy, et cetera, et cetera. And so as a result of it, for example, you have 52 countries computerizing their land registries between, in a 9-year time period, you've had such a large rollout of digitization. So, technological reforms, the good thing with them is that they reduce corruption. They are able to reduce information asymmetries. You can have better targeting of public goods, et cetera, et cetera. At least that's the argument. But what goes missing in all of that, the one-sided dialogues that we've been having are these 2 bullet points, which is you can have lower corruption on one angle, but given that people and their incentives haven't changed, that social structure probably changes in a way in which you can have a displacement of corruption from one side or one activity onto another. Or you can have people who are, it can also be displaced across individuals. Moreover, it can and it does disrupt the organization of bureaucracies. And what I mean by that is, whenever you have a digital technology coming in, you replace some tasks, you can have more specialized bureaucracies. On top of that, of course, technology is going to change the embeddedness, it's going to change social interactions between people. And it's actually this side that the conversation is completely missing. So there's little empirical evidence on how technology has an impact or interacts with this sort of inner working of the bureaucracy, right? So in this paper, we're asking, do technology-based state capacity reforms have spillover effects on the organization of bureaucracies and their effectiveness? And the reform that we're looking at is the digitization of land records that happened in Punjab, Pakistan. It was a staggered rollout. And we're looking at the capacity of the state to collect taxes. So just to give you a snapshot, what these land records did is that they fixed property rights to the extent that it reduced property rights uncertainty. And we're trying to see, because in some sense it's a legal capacity reform. So we're trying to see how that legal capacity reform spills over into the fiscal capacity of the state or not. So what we do is, we're able to exploit the staggered rollout of the program, and the identification strategies are classic differences and differences. The tax that we're looking at is the agricultural income tax, and the tax base there is cultivated area and farm profits. And the big heavy lifting came in actually both of these things. So this data was hand collected and then digitized, and this is agricultural tax data from 2006 to 2013. And then to be able to look deeply into the bureaucracy itself, we did a survey with the local bureaucrats, which was a retrospective survey of what happened before digitization, what happened after, and we're able to build career trajectories and then connect it with the tax data, so we can see individuals performing before and after the reform of different types as well. So what's the big result? Contrary to results that are almost always positive of digitization, we actually find that once the state digitized land records, it had a negative effect on tax collection, right? What does that mean? It means that the state is fixing one end, and instead of there being a complementarity, you have a fall in tax collection. So you're negatively impacting fiscal capacity. And we look deeply into the mechanisms. This is not driven by tax base. So it wasn't the case that fixing of property rights led to a fall in the tax base. On the contrary, it actually improved the tax base, and there's now a paper that's out in GIA which shows that tax base actually went up, land, labor market frictions reduced, and so this was, in essence, for the market, this was a good reform, but for the bureaucracy, it ended up having some negative consequences. What we see when we combine this survey data with the tax data is that it's actually the bureaucrats' capacity to collect taxes, and then we have some results on what the exact mechanism within that can be. So this is the background. This is obviously not visible at all, but there are 3 phases of the program, and this was supposed to be rolled out starting 2009, but that did not happen. In the paper, we go into details about how balanced these are. These are in essence balanced, except that phase 1 had more of a lower population than the rest. And so what were the direct effects of the reform? The first was, it was good for the market. Land and labor market frictions reduced, it strengthened property rights. The average transaction time went down, I'm just checking the time. The average transaction time went down from 2 months to 45 minutes, which is phenomenal, right? It's a great thing to have. And then 72% of users perceived the new system to be more secure, and 60% of users reported reduced land disputes. So in essence, there is something positive that's happening in the market. The thing that this digitization reform changed were these 3. First, it changed the scope of tasks that bureaucrats were doing. So before this reform happened, the bureaucrats at the revenue circle level were collecting taxes, assessing taxes, and then they were also in charge of land records, which means that they were fixing the land records and also giving out land titles, which of course is a high frequency event. Then after the reform, this land record business, all of this went to a separate bureaucracy. People who are from Pakistan, I don't need to convince this audience. It takes me a while in the US for them to understand what's happening. But the land record business, just like, it went to a different bureaucracy, a new setup was put in place, there were Arazi centers, and so this has kind of taken off. The thing that, on top of that, what happened is that it reduced the frequency of meetings of the bureaucrat with the tax payers, right? And for those of us who are familiar with that literature on embeddedness, it changed that embeddedness of the bureaucrat in that society. Economists would say, oh, that's great, it reduced corruption, but I have a different way of thinking about it. And then it also, so while there was a reduction in bribes, because now you're not giving out land titles to people, right? So now you don't have that high frequency event happening, but it, while it changed bribes in that setting, they do talk about, I'll show you results which show that this corruption displaced from land titles onto tax collection and assessment. So what kind of data we have? We have the planned rollout of the digitization across different districts. This was collected from the project office once it was in place. Now there's no longer a project office. Then we also had the actual rollout of digitization across villages in Punjab, which we got from the PLRA. Like I said, the heavy lifting comes here. Can you click on the picture for me? And so this is actually, this data helps with, trying to address this larger research agenda on state capacity. And does it not work? Chalo koi nahi, chhod de. So, so this, I was able to get this data from the Board of Revenue's record room, which is in their basement, and it took a while, and so there is, there's a lot of good data. And the reason I'm saying this is because there are other researchers in the room, and so if anybody wants to collaborate and work on it, you're more than welcome to talk to me. Then the last set of things we did was we talked to these bureaucrats, and we carried out 2 sets of, we did a repeat sort of survey. So we did the survey once with 1 set of bureaucrats, and then we went in again because we wanted to rebuild their career trajectory so that we could then combine it with this tax data. It was a long effort of string matching and like double checking. So now we are able to look at districts and over time, but we're also able to look at bureaucrats over time, which is good for us. So it's a classic difference in difference, 2-way fixed effects. You have district fixed effect, time fixed effect. The outcomes we're looking at are tax collected in a district. Our outcome is right skewed, so we have inverse hyperbolic sine, which is basically nothing more than a log 1 plus the outcome. And then we also report taxes in rupee. The digitization dummy is it takes phase 1 and 2, and then it switches on 1 after digitization and remains 0 after. So this is what we find. So this is showing you each dot is a coefficient, and then the bars are 95% confidence intervals. So you can see pre-reform, these digitized, non-digitized are sort of similar, except a little bit of up and down, but we don't see a large effect. But once you reach this side, we're only able to estimate, by the way, effects for 2 years, so this is a short-run effect. Once you reach this side, you see that the magnitude of this fall is pretty large. So even if you ignore the significance and whatever, the economic magnitude of this negative effect is quite large. And this you can see also from, so maybe people can focus on these percentage changes. The first column is tax collected IHS, and then the second one is tax collected in levels and rupees. And you can see that the effects range from 49% to 84%. Once we first saw this, we were like, okay, this is super large, this is a little bit too much. Maybe it's a short run, like there's too much adjustment going on. But actually, if you look at it and you place this in the literature, it is not a very far removed, effect that we are seeing in other studies as well. So if you see this study on e-filings, you have e-filings, and that led to a 40% reduction. So the kind of effects that are there in the literature, ours is sort of in the middle of that. And then the thing that we take away from this is, across 36 districts, there is a, we actually lost. So we had digitization, I'm not doing a welfare analysis here, but we had digitization, fixed labor market, land market, but it led to a loss of 290 million, which is almost the same as supporting 15,000 families on BISP. I'm going to ignore this. This is, the recent literature on diff and diff is rife with like lots of robustness checks. We did all of them. Happy to talk more about it. But I'm more interested in talking about the mechanism. So, the first, sort of cut of results is that digitization led to a fall in tax collection. Then, we were curious whether it's because of a fall in tax base. And so Sabrine Baig has a paper exactly on this. And so we wanted to like retest that within our sample and see what's going on. And so when we looked at data, and I'm going to show you in a second that table, we don't see any negative effects on tax base. If anything, it actually went up. It's actually, all the action is coming from the bureaucrats' capacity to collect taxes, which is coming from, first, they assess less, and then on top of that, as a fraction of that assessment, they're also collecting less. So it's also the effort margin plus the collusion or assessment margin that's happening. So this is the effects on tax base. We collected satellite data on vegetation cover because recall that the tax is on agricultural cultivated area and then profits. So we have data from household surveys that the government collects, that the government does, and it's log farm level profit per acre. We combine that with, we have vegetation cover data, which is satellite imagery, and then these again are proxies for that cultivated area. If you can see, the effects, forget the significance, the effects themselves are pretty small as well. So you don't see any negative effect on cultivated area, but in fact, you see a positive effect on profits. So if anything, you should have had a positive effect on fiscal capacity, which you don't. So then we looked at, this is coming from, what are the taxes that were assessed by these bureaucrats. So these bureaucrats are in charge of going to the farms. If people who are familiar with this, the Patwari or the people we're studying are Gardavar. They actually go into the field with the Patwari, or the Patwari goes. And so their team is supposed to be visiting these crops, these cultivated area, and then write down this much sown, this much cultivated, this is the tax levied. And so they're in charge, funnily enough, of the assessment itself. And so you can see, compare this to the fact that satellite imagery is not showing you a fall in cultivated area, right? Compared to that, you're seeing a fall of tax demand that goes, we have two measures of this assessment. This is coming from the Board of Revenue itself. And you see a fall in tax demand. On top of that, when we look at the more disaggregated data, there is actually a fall in log reported cultivated area by these bureaucrats as well. And so this is suggesting, if you place this again in the literature, this is suggesting that collusion between that bureaucrat and that taxpayer has gone up. And one of the reasons we think that can happen is because now there are no longer those land transactions, right? So you have to, if there is a threshold of income that you want, there is a task that you could get rents on, that task is away. Now the only task you're left with is this, and so maybe that increases the collusion you have, and so that increases your bribes. Then this right here is a bureaucrat level panel, and so you're looking at within bureaucrat variation in how much taxes they're collecting. And so the first thing you can see, so these are the outcomes: tax collected as a fraction of tax assessed. So tax target is actually tax assessed. Whether at least 50% tax target was achieved, whether at least 75% was achieved, and then the share of months with zero tax collection. So you can see after tax collection, there's a sizable drop in that bureaucrat's performance. So notice that because we're using a within bureaucrat variation, we're sort of controlling for the ability or the unobserved heterogeneity of that bureaucrat as well. So you can see that taxes fell, tax base, nothing happened, but both on tax assessment and on tax collection, conditional on that assessment, you see a fall in performance. And so we use survey data and we ask them actually, do you think digitization has helped you with tax collection? 39% said no change, some said yes, some said no, but then actually a large, 46% are saying digitization has actually made it worse. And we said, why is it that it has made it worse? And so the arguments that they put forth is, now we have less leverage over people. So there's less influence due to less public dealing. And we can translate that into less information, less bribes, etc. But it's basically that literature on leverage that is what it speaks to. And so the key takeaway here is digitization reduced tax collection, not due to a fall in tax base. It's coming from lower bureaucratic capacity to collect taxes. And so, it changed the collusion dynamics. Removing one task, you can focus all your energies on the other task and do more collusion. And then there's loss of bargaining power of that. So when I did this field work with the bureaucrats, and I was, the interviews, I'm almost out of time. Okay, so the interviews I conducted, I was told that actually, earlier we used to, withhold their land titles and then say, you have to pay taxes, otherwise I'm not going to give you your land title. And now we've lost that leverage. So all in all, implications for state capacity reform, we know that now digitization is widespread. Like I said, there are 52 countries that digitize within 9 years. That's like a huge agenda that the international organizations are pushing forward. And this idea that this bureaucrat was doing both land records and tax collection, it's not a novel idea. This is the fact that bureaucrats have multiple tasks is something that's like, it pervades public sector bureaucracies across the world. And so, our key takeaway is that whenever you do these kind of technological reforms, first of all, you need to sit back and think about the set of people that you're influencing or the organization that you're going to change, and either couple them with some kind of incentive schemes or understand how social interactions are changing, or you need, you can't have piecemeal reforms where you set up the digitization as like, okay, now there's one bureaucracy and you left the other bureaucracy, with no changing incentives, et cetera, to still collect taxes. Okay, thank you. I'm going to stop here. Please go ahead.
So thank you so much for this paper. And echoing Erum, I think that this was the kind of data collection effort that had me flabbergasted, because I was like, I don't even know what has gone into this kind of data collection effort. Also because at one point, I was trying to collect data in the basement of the FPSC, and it didn't work out. So I know how hard that can be. All right, so the paper is basically about investment in one form of state capacity and how that actually reduces another form of state capacity. The objective of the reform is to make property rights more secure, and that happens because profits go up. However, taxes that are collected have actually reduced, and the mechanism that is talked about is basically a reduction in influence, right? And as a political scientist, I have no problem in buying that result, because I think that the way bureaucrats and politicians function in clientelistic societies is very different. So you need those kind of personalistic relationships to be able to achieve things efficiently. I'm not entirely convinced as to why you frame this as a reduction in this reduction in tax collection as a reduction in bureaucrats' performance and a loss of bureaucratic ability. Because as I was reading the paper, I kept thinking, is it just not a reduction in extortion? So perhaps they were collecting more taxes because they could, and now taxes are aligning better with the cultivated area that actually exists. And you show that cultivated area has not changed according to satellite imagery, but one thing I think you can very easily do is show whether the assessment of the tax collectors now aligns better with the satellite imagery. So that is, I don't know if this was in the appendix, but I didn't see a discussion of, well, now because these records have been digitized and you have data from satellite imagery, we see that this reassessment, even though it is lower, it is aligning better with the cultivated area. So in that sense, is this really signaling a lack of influence and reduced distortion as a result of that loss in influence? Or is it signaling higher levels of collusion? Also, in terms of collusion, I find that a little contradictory. So you say that there's less public dealing, but at the same time, you're claiming that there might be collusion, which is why the tax targets have dropped. And so I was just thinking that that might be a little difficult to sell, because on the one hand, if they're not meeting as often, then how would they collude to reduce the tax target? And finally, I think in the paper, there is more of a discussion on how there are profit-based taxes. So large landlords are paying taxation on profits, and smaller landlords are paying taxation on cultivated area. And so I also wanted to know whether this would, in the long term, shift taxation towards higher taxation of profit-based landlords that are larger landlords, and away from this, away from cultivated area landlords that are smaller landlords. So maybe in the long run, it is reducing taxes from these farmers, but actually raising taxes on another set. And so this is actually a progressive reform in that sense. But thank you so much. Those are all my comments. Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, so we can start off over here.
Great work. This is Imran. I did some work in digital transformation earlier in my life, so based on that, not a direct comment on the paper, but just certain observations for future possible work. I mean, digitization is great and all of that, but it does introduce a lot of burden and friction, and I'll give you a simple example. A few years back, the government decided that the applications to colleges from students who do FA, FSC will be all online. So the burden that created on rural population was that, for example, we do some social work in my villages, and a lot of kids started complaining that internet is just not available. How do I even file an application, right? So something that's supposed to make your life easier, it actually made your life difficult, because previously you could ask someone who's going to the city, hey, you're going to the city, bring the prospectus or whatever that is, fill it out, and another person who's going will deposit it. But now, that loop was cut off, so actually it introduces a burden instead of facilitating it. So that's one comment, and my second comment is that a lot of these projects are financed by World Bank funding and others, and they are all nice, shining and glossy when they come out, but UPS batteries die down in 2 years, and generators break down after 4 years. And then that actually could create a huge issue, because now you have systems that are even more dysfunctional than paper and pen 4 years down the road. So how do you account for maintenance of these systems? And that's something that, as a society and as a political and economic scientists, we need to think about. And finally, we can talk offline maybe later, but at least the property, the land tax bill that my family is still getting is actually with a, on a pen and paper, and is not coming from a computer. And I can actually literally give you a copy of the last one that we received. So maybe some of that is playing into, why tax collection is not reconciling, and you're actually seeing a dip because it's, paper versus pen, and to your point of systems not being digitized through and through. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Isra. So I had a question on whether or not maybe the reduction in tax has something to do with the fact that maybe the state just doesn't have the capacity anymore, because I did a bit of research on this, and some of the senior officials in like the Board of Revenue would say, oh, we just don't have enough patwaris and stuff anymore to just go and do our work for us anymore. Enrollments in this have fallen a lot. So maybe this is more of a capacity issue on that end. And the other, based on what was just said, is that I know the Arazi record centers have been digitized, but there's still a fair bit of reliance on the patwari anyway, even now, in a lot of these systems. So how have you exactly accounted for the fact that this might not have just completely eliminated it? Because this is still a discussion that is having that we've digitized everything, but people are still relying on the patwari and stuff for land record management and stuff. Yeah,
so can I respond? Because then I'm not a very good, I won't remember. So, I think all these points are well taken. The first thing was coming to this gentleman on this side, was that, of course, digitization creates frictions. There are papers on that. You have lower targeting. You can have distributional consequences, and I think some of the papers here have already shown that you will have distributional consequences. But we're not really, we're not speaking to the direct effect of the digitization on, markets, for example, on what's happening to land and labor, because that agenda is sort of already fertile, and you're getting a lot of papers there. What we are trying to say is that it has an impact on the bureaucracy itself. So it's not about the households, that's not the unit of analysis here, it's about the bureaucracy itself that we want to talk about. And then this idea that, that there could be more dysfunction, I think on the contrary, as far as my understanding goes, the paper that studies this directly, I mean, from my understanding, so that paper doesn't study the bureaucracy, the new bureaucracy itself. That paper is studying what happens to the markets. We don't see that dysfunction. Maybe in the long run, but we haven't reached that long run as yet. So maybe in the long run, there will be more dysfunction if the external environment changes, but this reform at least is not that one of those. Then the last thing was, people are getting, so the effects I showed you were the intention to treat effects, which means that, it's the intention of the government to digitize, and that's the variation we use, not the actual variation, which basically means that there are still villages that do not have, that don't have their Mozas live on a Razi center. That doesn't mean that every single, land record has been digitized, for sure. That's not the case. And maybe the one that they were talking about was more for the urban setup, because in the urban setup, I have no idea what goes on there. Maybe that's less computerized. It doesn't seem like it. So there were great questions on this side. The effects I'm studying are the effects for 2 years after the reform. And as far as my understanding goes, patwaris you're correct in saying that, you are losing patwaris. I think they earlier had around 6,500. They're now left at 5,800, something like that. But the effects that I'm studying are so short run that you're not going to see a large drop off of that patwari, right? In the long run, maybe you're losing human capital and you're not getting in the new patwaris, you're not hiring new patwaris. And that's another paper to be written, but I completely agree with you. The thing that I think I haven't talked about it here, but in the paper we explore this idea that maybe it's just that transition from one system to the other, which means that a lot of burden fell on the patwaris. And so we did that. In the survey, we asked them about their tasks, their time use, their, what kind of tasks they're doing. And you're correct that patwaris were involved. They were not involved in land records, but they were involved in record correction and trying to fix that problem. But if we look at their time use, there is no statistically significant difference in the time that they're spending on the job in the digitized versus non-digitized. So although the nature of the job has changed, the number of hours they're spending has not changed. So you should still not see a negative effect, right, if the tasks are the same. And now, if there's time, I can go to Aman. Otherwise, we can have another round of questions. Aman, I think, no?
I think you partly answered it, so I'll let someone else go.
Okay.
The tax that you mentioned, which is being collected, is an income tax. My understanding is that a large part of the tax in agriculture is collected as a land tax. To what extent is that distribution between land tax and income tax changing, and what proportion is currently being collected in this form?
That's Shahbano's question also. That's yours.
So
Thank you.
Thank you. This was very interesting. I'm Anam. I think this has kind of been hinted at by a few people, but maybe if you could speak to it directly. So the impact on the bureaucracy, I guess I can imagine like two different channels, two different kinds of impacts. And to me, it sounded like what you're saying is that bureaucrats don't have this task anymore. And because of that, they have fewer social interactions with people and hence less leverage. But could it also be that, you know, and that's where I think some of the points around how well digitization actually works come in. The ability of bureaucrats to interface with the digitized system. If some are digitized and others are not digitized, then do they just ignore the digitized records altogether? And then that creates a hurdle for them to go through. So just how the quality of digitization may actually affect bureaucratic behavior. I mean, I'm also thinking of this, you know, in the context of, I paid a recent visit to Nadra for my passport, and, you know, Nadra has digitized a whole bunch of systems, but, and their online forms, you can do them from abroad. And this is obviously a totally different system, but, you know, it was that quality question.
Okay, great, thank you. One last, and then I can quickly answer then.
Thank you for the presentation, and I found it very insightful. I have a few questions, one being very simple, asking whether it was an immediate change to digitization, whether as soon as the system was developed, they just immediately stuck with that. Because in my experiences working with the public sector, in some cases of digitization, it's a very gradual shift where they keep it a hybrid in a sense where they have both paper records and online records, and then eventually move to digitization, because I feel that affects the ending result in terms of in this case, tax collection. Secondly, I wanted to ask the conclusion here being that there was a reduction in tax collection because possibly of a reduction in leverage. So I wanted to ask that whether this was the people in the actual bureaucracy suspected this, and whether this would call for them to investigate this further and perhaps introduce penalties for underreporting on behalf of the people, as to whether that was a possible mechanism.
I didn't quite catch that. Sorry, can you repeat it?
So one of the conclusions was that there was an increase, reduction due to the reduction in leverage that reduced tax collection.
Yeah.
So, and I suppose implication of that is that means that the people themselves are underreporting the landowners. Okay. So whether that calls for further penalties for them, or whether this was something that would potentially be further investigated. Lastly, I just wanted to ask one last thing, that if power reduces and that reduces tax collection, and the solution to that would potentially be to increase leverage, how do you increase leverage without, again, increasing the propensity for corruption and misreporting amongst the bureaucrats? And I suppose you mentioned a few incentivization strategies potentially. So I wanted to, if you could touch upon them, if you perhaps know them, if you have the time, obviously. So,
do I just have 1 minute? Yeah. Probably, or I'm happy to chat offline if that.
We need to move on to Erum's paper, so
okay.
Just take a minute to say.
Okay, I think, let me just start with this, gentleman. So we now are digitizing it, you know, I did a first round of digitization where I tried to just get at the final, like what's the tax collection, which included both income tax and the tax on their income as well as cultivated area. Now what we're doing is re-digitizing so that we can separate out these two things. From my understanding in the field is that because income taxation is very self-reported, which means that, you know, you have to come and file a tax for your previous year's agricultural income, it's really not done. I mean, the only thing that they do is the government knows that anybody who's above 50 acres, the government would go to them themselves. And so there's an expectation that larger landowners are the ones that are going to file. So in essence, it remains, the most documented part is cultivated area, and that's the one that gets taxed. Happy to chat offline so that I don't take up too much time. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Our final speaker, Erum, joining us from Wooster College in Ohio.
thing work? All right, wonderful. So I'm so thrilled to be here, not least because this paper was kind of conceived in Lahore. My work is primarily on Karachi. I look at the privatization of public service delivery, primarily of electricity. And so I've spent sort of the last 6 years immersed in Karachi's privatization effort with K Electric, and I'm happy to talk about this more. But what I'm going to do is actually tell you my comparative case study today, which is on Lahore. So really, I want you to take this in the context of a comparison between what was happening in Karachi, which for me is a lot more detailed, and I can go into a lot more detail on that. But this is really my sort of a final chapter where I look at, Pakistan is this state that is in a chronic electricity crisis. We're talking about chronic debt when it comes to payments for energy. And Lahore is the second largest city in the country that has been facing the threat of privatization for a very long time, but has not been privatized. Its DISCOM, its distribution company, is still a state-owned company. And so I was very curious about how equivalent sort of people, and specifically sort of middle and upper middle class people, but then also sort of the lower sector, thinks about energy, right? And so I'll go into detail on that. I also, before starting, want to thank Dr. Umair Javed, who was instrumental in helping me train and get this survey off the ground. He was a co-PI on the ground that was provided by IGC. Okay, so this is my original fieldwork, right? I start here as a graduate student in 2017. I go to a lot of different constituencies in Karachi, and I start talking to them about what life is like under a privatized service delivery regime. Okay, and I tell them, what were you doing before? And they tell me, well, in Muzaffarabad, in Kurangi, the ANP would sort of come around, some guy would come around and give us these little parchees, these little like paper handwritten bills for electricity, and we would pay them. And we assume that he used to go and then pay KESC or whatever it was, right? And now, since privatization, which sort of in its most recent iteration took place in 2009, K Electric, which is the newly privatized bureaucracy, treats us as individuals. So even if we go collectively and we say, look, this area has suffered outages, we've paid our bills, what's going on? They say, show us your individual bill, right? So show us the bill that comes to your house. We're not interested in this collective action. Like, we don't understand it, right? They don't have any capacity to sort of absorb this kind of collective action. So we used to just pay ANP for the bill, now we're individuals. The finding that I have in my book is that this has had a tremendous effect on trust in others. So because K Electric has been extremely successful at giving people this individual accountability, or telling them that, look, you will get electricity for as much as you pay for, we can talk about whether that's accurate or not, you need to first deliver yourself as a consumer, and then you will get that benefit. Right? This is a pay-for-use system. And so what I found in sort of on my core work is that instead of blaming K Electric or blaming the government when they have bad service outage, they blame each other. Right? So they'll say, well, I paid my bill, and this guy didn't pay his bill, and that's why our entire neighborhood is subjected to collective punishment, but it's his fault, right? They don't blame the system of collective punishment. So this is the kind of socialization, right? So I've done extensive work on the socialization that takes place when something is privatized. Lahore presents me with a really interesting comparison. What is the kind of political socialization that takes place when the threat of privatization is present, right? That the system doesn't privatize, but the threat is ever present. That, oh, Lahore might privatize its electricity. And there was sort of PMLN does Ijaz against this, and there's a lot of stuff in the news and whatnot, right? And so this is actually my RA, Ijaz from LUMS from a few years ago. And so she was very kind and sort of took me around and did sort of field work with me. And we went to Chungi Amar Sidhu, which had just recently before this had massive protests against a loss of electricity, right? So they had load shedding for days, or outages, or that transformer had busted. And they were on the street. So if you guys were here during that time, you remember just before the pandemic, unhone puri Kenchi ka jo ilaka tha, they just closed off the road in that entire neighborhood, right? And Azra, this lady in Chungi Amar Sidhu, tells me that you have to break some windows. And I found this so interesting. She's openly admitting to the fact that, collective action is not always pleasant, right? It can be violent as well. Like, nobody was hurt, but, they see this as something that they're entitled to. Nothing happens if you don't go in a group. So this is really the puzzle for me, right? Like over here you have a very similar group of people. These are urban residents of Pakistan having very different attitudes towards a common resource that everybody in an urban center needs, which is electricity, okay? These guys are like, well, we're individuals. We'll only get electricity if the other person is paying their bill. And here, nothing happens if you don't go in a group. So kind of these, opposite. And so the puzzle for me was, these are highly competitive political constituencies. One where electricity is privatized, the other the threat of privatization is ever present. I want to know whether do repeated and well-publicized attempts to privatize electricity shape attitudes towards it as a commodity or a right. I want to know to the extent to which Lahore's middle and upper middle classes are tolerant of forms of non-payment and theft. And I want to see what is the impact of this on trust between individuals and towards the state. Okay, so I'm going to briefly situate this paper in my larger book project. I'm going to provide an overview of my larger theoretical framework. Descriptively, I'm going to provide you the context of electricity service in Lahore and findings from a research experiment. To foreground some of these, I found the respondents' report being in favor of punishing defaulters, right? But a significant number are also not paying their bills. Okay, so it's not like they are hiding the fact that they don't pay their bills, right? And I'm finding that in Karachi, there's a lot more sort of emphasis on the fact that we are paying our bills, whereas here it's like, meh, if I have a hard month, if I don't get the kind of income that I needed, I can't skip my bill. Second, what I'm really finding here is that they are very much more tolerant towards theft by low-income individuals, right? And also sort of differential results of this as well. Okay. So my introduction to the book project is that states no longer exclusively provide public goods. Many of us sitting here in the audience know this. I asked, how do political parties enable this process? And so I've done that work in Karachi. I look at how this shapes attitudes towards the state and then towards each other. And then the final chapter is a comparative study with other cities in South Asia. And I'm happy to talk about any part of this during the Q&A. So I'm going to be presenting this today. So there's really good work on why states outsource, right? And so the two directions that I'm interested in is that there's a supply side, so there's the state itself getting pressure from the outside saying you have to privatize, you have to rationalize your payments for things like energy, you're spending too much of taxpayer money. But then there's also a democratic process through which states engage in reforms, right? So Martin Schefter has written really extensively about how middle and upper middle income groups can provide a constituency for reform, right? Because they get tired of going to bureaucrats. And we've seen some really great papers on how you want to cut out the middleman. If I'm paying my bill, I should just get electricity. Let's keep it simple. Then I can move on to using my energy for other things. And then Rebecca Weiss-Shapiro and others have done this as well, is that as middle classes grow in Latin America and Argentina, they have started demanding a lot more things as pay for use. Right? And the puzzle here is, well, Lahore is a prime example of a middle class that could be demanding something for pay for use, and it's not doing it. Utility reforms are expected to engender trust and create transparency, and yet many of them create clear losers who are low-income and working-class people. So we can see that there's this clash, right? So you can see that the vested interest in keeping this as a public state firm is probably from the working class and low-income people, whereas the constituency for reform is typically from middle and higher-income groups. I suggest the political impacts of privatization are under-theorized, and in particular, I'm interested in this idea of the political influence in state service delivery, which has been characterized as perverse incentives by Sue Stokes and others. And what you find is that, of course, where there is this kind of perverse incentive for politicians to keep something within the state, there is a trickle-down effect to the poorest voters, who are typically their constituents as well. Okay. The other really important piece that guides my research is a recent, well, I guess it's now, several years ago, but a really famous study by Burgess and al. In Bihar that shows that there is a higher tolerance for theft where something is considered an entitlement, right? Particularly where it's delivered by the state. And it's really interesting because I think he correctly points out that it makes elites tolerant of theft, right? So we're not so concerned about whether lower income groups are tolerant of theft because they are presumably they are the ones participant in the theft. It's how people who stand to benefit from a pay-for-use system are also more tolerant of other people stealing. And this is particularly concerning for long-term resource scarcity, especially water and energy needs, and we've talked extensively about sort of the environmental and climate pressures that Pakistan is under. And privatization, and I say this in air quotes because I've sort of done this very extensive study on privatization, offers a potential solution. And in Lahore, the privatization of LESCO has been debated several times. Okay, so I'm going to skip over this. The thing I want to tell you is that we actually don't know what Lahore's distribution looks like. And I can say that with confidence because the state of the art in the room is here with Ijlal Naqvi's work, right? And so this is a framework that I borrowed from him. And so what we are, and hopefully we are sort of going to be collaborating on this, one of the things that we're interested in is whether neighborhoods face disproportionate outages because of the pressure that Lahore has been under to rationalize its electricity consumption. Okay, so I have two hypotheses. Really simply, I want to know whether people are tolerant of theft among others, and then if you have a favorite political party, say I'm a PTI voter, and I give you a prime saying PTI is proposing these reforms that are going to make electricity pay for use, does that reduce or improve your baseline vote for them? Okay, so really, really simple. The data is a simple 2,000 household face-to-face survey conducted by Gallup in Lahore, and it's primarily focused on urban Lahore, but it is representative throughout Lahore, which is important, okay? So I want to show you a couple of descriptive pictures of what we found in our survey. It's a face-to-face survey that happened right before the pandemic, so we're very lucky with the timing of it. And we found that, outages are fairly evenly distributed throughout, right? So I'll show you sort of different. The thing I'm also really interested in is how does billing look, right? So billing over here does tend to go up as you go into higher income categories, right? There's some noisiness, but really there is this sort of upward slope. And so here's the way I look at this. In Karachi, there's a lot of noisiness around the middle income sector, right? Whereas in Lahore, it feels like it's a much tighter confidence interval here. This doesn't really tell us much, right? These bureaucracies are both doing sort of a lot of work in terms of trying to reconcile bills with usage. This is an imperfect system, but it's interesting to see that this is a private bureaucracy giving you sort of variable bills, even though you should be around sort of this line in terms of your household consumption or electricity, whereas the public bureaucracy seems to be doing slightly better. I don't know. So we can debate whether how the public bureaucracy is performing versus this. The really interesting thing, and this is something that just came out recently, this is what outages look like in Karachi, right? So now I've done this survey for 2 rounds now. We had one in 2018. We had another one last year with my co-author. If you go to a higher household income level, you will face fewer outages. This is a classic pay for use. Right? Why? Because not only are you more capable and willing, presumably, to pay your bill, the people you live amongst are presumably also more willing and able to pay their bills. So if I'm in a good cluster that has been identified by K Electric as a good cluster, they will favorably target me with fewer outages. So at the highest end over here, you have like 2 hours, even in the heat, in the peak of summer. Whereas over here, an average of like about 7 to 8 hours of outage for the lowest of low. Does anybody want to guess what Lahore looks like? Any takers? Sort of like this. What do you think outages in Lahore look like across income? Flatline. Amazing, right? So this is to me where I'm like, okay, this is incredible, right? And for so many different levels, I want to get into this. But this idea that you have a public bureaucracy that, in spite of having tremendous pressure to rationalize service delivery according to who is paying for it, you have these vast differences. And I think part of what's exciting about this work is that you can see the 2 largest cities in Pakistan have radically different approaches to energy provision at the household level. Okay, I want to get into this. Yes, yes. That's right. Yeah. So throughout a day.
You don't have energy available to you for whatever reason.
No, it's just sort of throughout a 24-hour period, how many times does the light go in your house? How many times is there an outage? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Load shedding. It's load shedding. Okay. All right. So very quickly, to what extent you agree with LESCO has higher favorability overall as opposed to K Electric, and that's not surprising at all. We can go into more details. I do want to do a quick work on the experiment. Okay, how should I do this? All right. So Experiment number 1. I will read you a story from Daily Jung. An individual was interviewed in Lahore City and had the following story. My bill amount was very high. I checked the bill, emerged the meter reader had only shown peak hours reading, but avoided normal reading. I took my complaint to LESCO. So this is a scenario that we're giving our respondents, right? I went to LESCO several times to resolve my issue. Nobody resolved my issue, so I just didn't pay my bill. Okay, I disconnected my meter, and when the LESCO meter reader came to my neighborhood, he threatened to report me, and I paid him a bribe. So this scenario of a person acting really badly, right? And there's a series of things that they're doing which are clearly like not nice, right? And so we asked, to what extent do you agree with this guy, right? So the baseline is like, to what extent do you agree with this person without knowing anything about them? And then after that, we have a prompt. We have some more information about who the person was who narrated this incident to the Daily Jung. And then we show them one of these 2 pictures. So treatment 1 is this working class guy, you know, the, sort of a blue-collar worker. And treatment 2 is a Safed Posh worker, right? Like a white-collar person. Okay, so what we find is that there is a lot more tolerance over here for the sort of for the white-collar individual, strangely. No, disagree, sorry. So there's a lot more tolerance for the blue-collar individual because people are more likely to say they somewhat agree with what he's doing compared to the group over here, right? So there's sort of a significant change here. What becomes interesting is, does this vary with higher and lower income people? And definitely there is less tolerance amongst the higher income categories, what you're finding, right? So there's a lot more tolerance for theft from blue-collar workers, from low-income people, and that's sort of an intuitive finding. I'm gonna sort of skip over experiment 2, happy to talk about it in Q&A. I want to conclude by saying energy costs and access are relatively evenly distributed across income groups in the city. I want to say that electricity is constructed as a right and an entitlement over here, right? Compared to a commodity in places like Karachi. Lahore's poorest residents feel mistreated by LESCO, but this is a good thing. That means they feel entitled to better treatment by them, right? And they have a strong sense of felt citizenship and access to government. So before the discussion, Ijaz asked me, like, how are people so favorable of LESCO? I said, they're not, but I think that's a good thing, right? I think that they actually have this sense of how they should be treated by them. And I think that this raises a really provocative question. Can we think beyond binaries of state provision and private service provision? Is there something in the middle, right? Given that Lahore has this higher to middle income group that might be slightly more tolerant of theft from lower income people depending on their circumstances, can we think of creative solutions to solving this puzzle of an energy crisis and also how to pay for it without burdening the taxpayer? Okay? Thank you very much. Look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Erum. And one of you will have to keep me honest regarding time, but I would rather listen.
I can time you.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would rather listen to Erum talk about this topic, which I'm interested in, rather than listen to myself. But that's me. So there were several aspects of this paper which were near and dear to my heart, but I was particularly interested in, and you know, one of the things that Erum said just at the end was that she went quickly through that data, but there was almost like a 75% favorable rating of LESCO among respondents to the survey, which I was astonished by. Did I get that number wrong? But it's like, you know, it's like a Pakistani national pastime. It's like we're going to watch the cricket, complain about the cricket team losing, and then complain about the electricity situation. When have you ever heard, you know, ordinary Pakistanis sitting around saying positive things about LESCO? Yeah. And yet, you know, the other aspect of this, which I thought Erum showed really well, which is that Lahori privilege is real, right? You're getting far better electricity provision than the rest. So in as much as people may have genuinely felt negative sentiments about the real impact of load shedding, and their high bills, which are also real, there should also be some kind of awareness. I'm not quite sure if you captured this, but like in the implicit rural comparison, and there were points at which it was so nice to hear this paper coming after the discussions that came earlier, particularly Mahvish's, where she's talking about a rural-urban comparison about villages. It's like, what is that implicit rural-urban comparison? Because LESCO also has a rural service area, right? And would we see similarly positive effects? Because the one thing that Erum makes a point of noting in the paper is that it is officially stated policy that the Karachi approach of reward and reprimand, i.e. that if you don't pay your electricity bill, you will get lesser electricity supply in terms of hours of load shedding in a day, is the official policy across Pakistan, but it's also been contradicted by NEPRA multiple times. However, it's less implemented, and where it's more likely to be implemented is a bias towards urban areas over rural, generally speaking. So rural areas will still definitely face more load shedding. But it's not strictly implemented, and certainly this socialization has never taken place that Erum talks about. And so that part is fascinating, because this idea of treating electricity as a right or as an entitlement, and I think maybe there we need to think very precisely about what exactly we're calling it, because in the fieldwork that I did with people, particularly Kachibalis in Islamabad, so a different city, but they were the only people who used electricity as a right. They talked about things as a right. I want an individual meter because it is my right. Mera hak banta, right? But nobody else used that language, right? And they didn't use that language, and the takeaway that I took from it, because they felt like it was a waste of their time, because that is not how you get anything done, right? How do you get things done? This is a story that we heard earlier in the day, that I'm going to get things done by using the connections that I have through the brokers that I'm connected to the people that I'm going to vote for, and so on. And the person that I vote for may or may not have a strong affiliation with the party identity, right? But that's how I'm going to resolve the issues, including electricity supply. And one note is that, in the literature you mentioned Alicia Holland talking about forbearance, but I think it's correct to say that the mayors in those cities actually have responsibility over electricity supply, which is not the case, at least in the strict sense. It is not the responsibility of any political actor to make decisions concerning electricity supply, let alone concerning whether or not there should be appropriate load shedding. All of that is through this informal set of relationships of influential people making connections and such. But to follow on with this topic of socialization towards electricity theft, in Lahore and elsewhere, because it is very much Karachi versus the rest of the country in that comparison. There's a line from Muhammad Hanif's Our Lady of Alice Bhatti, where the narrator is talking about someone who styles himself as a gangster, and the person who's responding says, no, he's nothing. He doesn't even steal, and electricity doesn't count, right? You can't be in... It's not a mark of theft because it's so widespread in these attitudes towards electricity. And I thought that came out very nicely in your survey results, where people actually, they were like, yeah, well, that's what you got to do. And the idea of going in a group, I think, was also very consistent with other things that I've seen about, like, to seek a collective redress is the way to gain attention for the things of one's concern. And perhaps lastly, this is a nice connection again to Karachi, where the Karachi drive to collect arrears on electricity bills goes by the name of sarbalandagi, right? That you hold your head up high, literally as a matter of self-respect in terms of this individual relationship with the state versus the very different sets of relationships that we're seeing elsewhere. Okay. Thank you, Erum, for a fantastic paper. And literally next week, I'm going to go to Islamabad to try and see if I can get the spatial data that she needs to be able to connect the survey results to the actual performance in those LESCO distribution areas. But now we can open the floor to questions from the room.
Thank you. My name is Nomana Amjad from Psychology Department, Punjab University. And you may wonder what I have to do with electricity apart from using it in DHA. Well, I did 2 trainings for K-Electric. First for the consumer violence they were experiencing in 2014, just into privatization very recently, and then 2016 on sustainable safety culture. So why did they need a psychology team apart from the engineers and everything they were doing? Consumer violence was baffling. Yes. So they attacked IBC, but at the same time, Karachi political governance and crime culture and peace was also lower than what it was when we went again in 2016. So one thing that I learned was that the highly influential and politically connected citizens who had not paid their bills also responded with violence to the IBC teams that turned up to collect bills at their doors. Whereas the poor Kunda people were, the whole city and K-Electric itself was more tolerant of the low-income consumers. So the contrast that you were drawing between Lahore and Karachi as a Lahore consumer going into Karachi, K-Electric is a very professionally run organization, highly paid upper portion, and then the linemen are highly distressed that although the privatization has happened, it has not trickled down to the salary increase of the lower strata. So that discontent was feeding into, so the contrast between Lahore consumer culture and Karachi consumer culture was a very stunning discovery for me as a social scientist. So I would like you to answer that. Does the situation improved, as it seems, in 2018 and since 2016?
Let's take one or two more questions.
Thank you, Professor Haider. I had a question about the socialization aspect that you were talking about. So you were saying that in Karachi, since the privatization of KESC into K Electric, if a person is not getting electricity in their house, they would be blaming perhaps their neighbor for not paying their bill, which is why they're losing out their electricity. I understand that people would be intolerant of electricity theft.
Right.
But how does this dynamic work, that because my neighbor didn't pay for their bill, I'm losing out on my electricity?
Great question. All right, great, thank you. Let's see. So, I want to actually take my discussant's questions first. So, Ijlal, thank you. That was super helpful, as always. I think there is an implicit rural comparison here. I would have liked to I think because we only had 2,000 households to deal with, I wanted to make sure I was covering income groups within Lahore first, right? And then as an extension, I think covering the rural is also extremely important. But I think I can tell you that if I just took the case of urban Punjab, even the comparison between low-income people in Karachi and low-income people in Lahore is, to me, extraordinary. I mean, look at this, right? You have 100-degree weather across this country in peak summer. And one person who earns 20,000 rupees but lives in Karachi, Pakistan, is subject to 8 hours of outage in a normal day, right? By design. By the way, this is not a flaw. This is what the company says they are doing. It is on their website, right? It's not something that, oh, we don't know what. No, they know that they are targeting the poorest of the poor with the most amount of outages. And you can talk about, energy, you can talk about economic efficiency and things like that. There is an environmental justice issue here at play, right? Which wasn't there as much maybe when I was starting my fieldwork. 2023, we need to talk about what is happening here? What is life looking like at, 40 degrees Fahrenheit inside the house with 20,000 rupees in your pocket, okay? Over here, you have a low-income person who is relatively sheltered from the worst of international oil price shocks, from the pressures of technocracy. So even if I just kept this to an urban story, Ijlal, is what I'm saying, there's a really interesting contrast here, right? And my job as a political scientist is to tell you, if I'm a poor person living in Karachi versus me as a poor person living in Lahore, what is my idea of the state? And what is my idea of myself? How do I feel when my government ensures me that in the worst of summer, I still have as much electricity as this guy sitting here at 90,000 rupees? Versus over here, where I can see that contrast. This is grounds for a revolution, man. I mean, the people are going to break down your house one day, right? And say, we're stealing your ACs. So this is, to me, a really, really important comparison, and I hope my book can get this out. Which brings me to Sohaib's really great question, why would I blame my neighbors? K Electric has pulled off a brilliant trick. It has convinced people that they are solely responsible for their electricity. This is what the technocrats told them to do. This is what our government, through the NEPRA Act, told them to do. They've done it, okay? I can tell you that, guaranteed. Because you are made to feel like you are personally liable for your electricity is still provided collectively. So Ijlal's really great book that came out last year shows this. As discoms, we don't have the ability to shut off electricity at the consumer level or even target electricity at the consumer level. What we are doing is creating aggregates of 200, 300, 400 households in an urban area that are all provided by the same feeder. Then what do? You take an average. You say, okay, 40% of the people here pay their bills. This is a medium loss area. 3 hours of outages, 6 hours of outages, right? Then you make your calculation. Over here at this end, like I said, this is sort of, my mom's apartment in Clifton. She and her neighbors are all, salaried people. They all pay their bills on time. 2 hours of outage. Her cleaning lady who comes in, she's paying her bill every single month, but 2 doors down, that person has lost their job, their daughter's in the hospital, whatever, does not pay the bill. The entire neighborhood shut down. This is collective punishment. It works extremely well in industrial areas. So this is where they got the policy from, right? They got it from surveys and studies that said that if you have 100 factories, the way to convince all of them to pay their bill is that if even one person doesn't pay their bill, you shut down everybody. And then you get them to police each other. You can't do that with 500 households. That is externalizing the cost of information onto the end consumer. So what does this end consumer do? Very rightly says, it's my neighbor's fault, right? He or she is working with the information that they have. What does this do to politicization? It reduces your ability to act collectively. There are some small sort of areas in Karachi that still do have an anjuman or someone that they collectively act around, but it has reduced the ability to act collectively. And so, Dr. to your question, I agree. Karachi is a terrible, violent place. There are thugs, there are criminals, all sorts of gundas there. I'm from that place. The problem is if you are not giving, if you're putting people in this situation, right, and you're saying, okay, look, you've got to pay your bills, but the bureaucracy has been reduced in capacity. It's very professional. It's a third of the force it used to be when it was a state-owned electricity firm. By the way, I shouldn't fudge numbers. 36% recovery, it's not great, right? Like pre-privatization, we were not making any money from Karachi's electricity. I think the elite always find a way to make the best of any situation they're under. Whether it's state, whether it's private, it doesn't matter. To me, that's a less interesting question than how do we provide some kind of equitability. The other end of the spectrum that's really interesting, these guys are still here. They could be here, The elite in Lahore could be a really sweet deal where they get 2 hours of electricity. They just need to privatize, and yet somehow they're still at the same level of this person. So that's a mystery to me. And I'd love to, maybe after this, you guys can come up and give me your theories of why the elite in Lahore haven't actually petitioned or asked their governments to give them a privatized service firm. Thank you so much. This is great. Thank you.